We are in the Kuzari on page 291. And we're in a section where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is describing a pious individual, a saintly person. The saintly person is able to reconcile everything that he experiences in life with a righteous God. And the previous discussion was the saintly person coming to terms with creation. Like, why does Hashem make the things that he made in this world? Why does he make green trees and blue skies? Why does he make certain animals that don't seem to have any function? And when he looks into the creation, he's able to find the sense of order within nature, and that helps him reconcile some of the questions that he has. But of course, no one is left without questions. The difficulty is, or the challenge is, we can be left with questions. What do we do with those questions that we're left with? That's really the struggle in life, is when you're left with questions, how do you deal with them? Do you allow those questions and the difficulties and the unanswered dilemmas, do you allow that to upend your entire sense of commitment to a way of life, to a tradition that goes back millennia? Or do you say that I'm going to allow those questions to exist and I'm going to accept the overall system despite those questions? And have faith that at some point those questions will be answered. I believe that ultimately everything is for the best, even when I cannot come to reconciliation at the moment, but I believe that everything is for the best. And that's the approach that some of our great sages took to some great theological dilemmas about the existence of evil and the existence of suffering in the world. And that's what leads Rabbi Yehuda Halevi into subparagraph 25 on page 291 to talk about Nachum Ish Gamzo. He is an example of a person who was able to establish this conviction in his heart. What conviction? Because in the previous paragraph, he said that there are certain things that I don't understand why Hashem made them the way he made them. I therefore must justify the one who is called Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo, the rock whose acts are perfect. And then he says that Nachum Ish Gamzo is an example of a person who was able to find peace and reconciliation with this kind of argument. Whenever tragedy would befall him, he would say, "This too is for the good." The life of such a person is always pleasant, and suffering is light in his eyes. He may even rejoice in it if he considers the sins that he has committed. Now, what does he mean by that? Right? He's not a glutton for punishment, but he realizes that suffering expiates sin. So through this suffering, I feel a sense of cleansing, because I know that I have done certain things in my life, and I feel like Hashem is cleansing me, purifying me through that sense of suffering. He then looks upon the suffering with the eyes of someone who has just paid a debt and is joyfully relieved by having his burden removed. He rejoices in the reward and recompense that awaits him. He is also happy about his ability to teach others how to endure suffering and justify God's decrees, and he rejoices in the good name and great honor that he acquires because of his attributes. If I can act as a shining example for other people about how to endure suffering and still remain whole and complete, that in itself is a comfort to me. It's interesting. This idea that looking at suffering in a positive light, that's a theodicy. That's what it's, that branch of philosophy, or where we reconcile why bad things happen to good people, and we're able to find something good in it. The Mesilas Yesharim, or the Ramchal, also came to the same conclusion. We know that there are two stories that the Gemara brings, among many others, but the two main stories that the Gemara brings are about Nachum Ish Gamzo and about his disciple, Rabbi Akiva. They both had similar experiences in life, and they approached those experiences in very similar ways. I think most of you, if not all of you, are familiar in some way with these two stories. So I don't think, here, let me get you some sheets. So I don't think it's necessary for us to run through the stories verbatim, but I would like us to be familiar with the stories. So I'll just repeat the stories. I'll paraphrase the stories in short. The first story appears in Maseches Tainis because it's about the teacher Nachum Ish Gamzo, and we meet him for the first time in this story as a person who was afflicted with tremendous personal suffering. He was blind in both eyes, both his arms were amputated, both his legs were amputated, and his entire body was covered in boils. Now, many of you are familiar with the Unisana Tokef that we recite on Yom Kippur, and it's attributed to Rabbi Amnon of Mayence. And in that story, he too is someone who is a quadruple amputee, and his tongue was cut out, and he was done because he decreed it upon himself for having even intimated that he might consider converting to Christianity when the evil bishop had summoned him to the church. Some say that story never happened, but that it's a play on the story about Nachum Ish Gamzo. Because here the Talmud does describe a story about a man who was severely in a state of severe disability and was suffering terribly. He lived in a dilapidated house, and the legs of his beds were placed in buckets of water so that ants should not climb onto him. Sort of makes you think, well, he didn't have anyone to take care of him. I mean, this is a terrible situation. Once his students sought to remove his bed from the house and afterwards remove his other vessels, he said to them, "My sons, remove the vessels first, and then afterwards remove my bed. So, because as I can guarantee you that as long as I'm in the house will not collapse. But if you take me out first, the house will collapse and all of my possessions will be lost." So that's exactly what happened. They took out all of his furniture, and then they took him out of the house, and immediately afterwards the house collapsed, showing you that he was such a righteous person that miracles happened on his behalf. One of his students said, Rebbe, what is, how did this happen? So I think I cut and paste in the wrong way. I mixed up the story. But anyway, they asked him, "Rebbe, why did this happen to you? What did you do to deserve this to happen to you?" And he said that once upon a time, there was a poor person who came to me asking me for charity. And I was in the process of unloading my donkey and adjusting the animal's load. And I told him, just wait until I finish loading and adjusting my donkey's load and I'll take care of you. And during that interim period, the person died. The person claimed he was so impoverished that he had nothing to eat, and so he just collapsed and died. So Nachum Ish Gamzo said, I fell upon his face and said, "May my eyes which had no compassion on your eyes be blinded. May my hands which had no compassion on your hands be amputated. May my legs which had no compassion on your legs be amputated." And my mind did not rest until I said, "May my whole body be covered in boils." So that's how he became so in such a sorry state, because he decreed upon himself that because he did not help this poor person in time to save his life, that's the reason why he died. Why did they call him Nachum Ish Gamzu? Because he said that Gamzu L'Tova, everything that Hashem does is for the good, even though he was in this terrible, terrible state. And then the Gemara gives the famous story about the time when the government was oppressing Jews, and the Jews wanted to send a gift to appease the emperor. So they fill a chest with valuables, and they send it with some emissaries, and they say, let's send Nachum Ish Gamzu with this delegation because miracles happened because of him. This was, of course, it seems like it was before he became so afflicted towards the end of his life. So he travels with the delegation, and they stop off at an inn at night, and the innkeeper is unscrupulous, breaks into their treasure chest, steals all their treasures, and fills the treasure chest with dirt instead. And so Nachum Ish Gamzu discovers this, and he says, Gamzu L'Tova, this too is for the good. They bring the treasure chest, they open the chest in front of the emperor, and he says, what are you Jews doing to me? You're mocking me. You give me a gift and it's filled with dirt. And they say to him, Eliyahu Hanavi says, maybe these Jews are not mocking you. Maybe they're bringing you something that is really spectacular. After all, their ancestor was Abraham, who had miracles performed for him. So they tested the earth, and when they would throw it, the earth would turn into swords, and the pebbles would turn into weapons and spears. So this was magic dirt. This was Nachum Ish Gamzu's pronouncement that all is for the good. This too is for the good. So the king used it against the province that he was unable to conquer, and lo and behold, he ended up conquering the entire province using this magic dirt. So the king fills up the chest with precious jewels and gems and sends the Jews back with his blessings. They stop back at the same inn on the way home, and the innkeeper is surprised to see them because he figures they were probably killed by the king. But no, he says to them, what did you do? He said, well, we got this magic dirt when we stopped at your inn. And apparently it's miraculous. And the king, look how he rewarded us for it. So the innkeeper that night dug up dirt from the same place where he had placed the dirt into their treasure chest, brought it to the king, and he says, I have more magic dirt. And when the king tried to use it, it turned out to be just dirt. And that's how the innkeeper was put to death. And everyone ends off the way they're supposed to do, the way they're supposed to end off. So that's the story about Nachum Ish Gamzu. Now, Rabbi Akiva was a disciple of Nachum Ish Gamzu. And so the second story is from Maseches Brachos, which tells us the story that Rabbi Akiva said that one must always accustom oneself to say, everything that God does, he does for the best. And the Gemara relates like the following incident. When Rabbi Akiva was walking along the road and came to a certain city, he inquired about lodging and they did not give him any. He said, everything that God does, he does for the best. He went and slept in a field, and he had with him a rooster, a donkey, and a candle. A gust of wind came and extinguished the candle, a cat came and ate the rooster, and a lion came and ate the donkey. Chad Gadya. He said, everything that God does, he does for the best. That night, an army came and took the city into captivity. It turned out that Rabbi Akiva alone, who was not in the city and had no lit candle, noisy rooster, or donkey to give away his location, was saved. He said to them, didn't I tell you, everything that God does, he does for the best. Now, there's a couple of questions, first of all, on the teacher and the student. Why did the student change his line? Nachum Ish Gamzu said, Gamzu L'Tova. And Rabbi Akiva's line was, Kol man David Rachmana L'Tavavid. They both mean essentially the same thing. Nachum Ish Gamzu says, Gamzu L'Tova, this too is for the good. And Rabbi Akiva says, anything that God does, he does for the good. What's the difference between the two? So some commentaries just point out that Nachum Ish Gamzu, there was a place that he lived called Gamzu or Gimzu, and they just used the play on words. And that's why they called him the man of Gamzu, because he would say this too is for the good. So he used an alliteration based on the place where he came from. And Rabbi Akiva did not need to do that because he didn't come from a place called Gamzu or Gimzu. However, there are other commentaries who find significance in the subtle difference in language. Some say that Rabbi Akiva was greater, and some say that Nachum Ish Gamzu was greater. If you understand that Nachum Ish Gamzu was greater, it's because, and it seems that in this particular trait, Nachum Ish Gamzu was truly the master, because he was worthy of great miracles happening to him because he was such a tzaddik and he had such pure emunah. Because one of the commentaries says that he was able to see as something was happening that it's for the good. In other words, he saw the dirt as soon as they left the inn on their journey to the king's palace. He opens the chest and sees its dirt. He doesn't say, well, I'm sure something good will come out of this. He said, this is actually a good thing. And he didn't question how it was a good thing. He said, I know that it must be good. Rabbi Akiva's attitude was, it seems pretty bad now, but I'm confident that in the end something good will result. So it's a slight difference in theological perspective. One person can look at something that everyone else sees as terrible and says, no, this is really good. How? I don't know, but I'm sure it's good. And Rabbi Akiva's attitude is, I'm sure good will result. So it's a bit of a damper on what Nachum Ish Gamzu's attitude was. Rabbi Akiva says, yeah, it is bad now, but if we look down the road, this is a necessary stage for something good to happen later on. So that's how some Meforshim understand the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Nachum Ish Gamzu. Others suggest that Rabbi Akiva was on a higher level, that the student surpassed the teacher, because Nachum Ish Gamzu said, Gam zu l'tova, it's also for the good. In other words, I see the bad, but there's got to be also good here. And Rabbi Akiva said, Kol man David Rachmana, that the totality of it is good. In other words, there's no such adding on. It's not additionally good, it's completely good. So, and no matter how you learn it, you see that this was a tradition that Nachum Ish Gamzu had passed down to his student Rabbi Akiva. And it's the same kind of attitude that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is describing over here. The Ramchal, reflecting upon this attitude, also discusses this in describing a very, very pious individual. And that's in Mesilas Yesharim, chapter 19. He says, the first understanding, all that God does is for the good. For even this pain and difficulty which appears to one's eyes as evil is in truth nothing but true good. It is analogous to a doctor who must cut away flesh or amputate an infected limb so that the rest of the body may heal and not die. Even though the act appears at first to be cruel, it is really an act of true mercy in order to eventually benefit him in the end. The patient will not cease to love the doctor due to this act. Rather, on the contrary, he will love him even more. So I'm grateful to the doctor, even though the aftermath of his surgery ended up severely disabling me, but nevertheless, I am grateful because he saved my life. So this happens all the time, where people will express gratitude to a physician, to a surgeon. I mean, I've even had that experience in my own family. You express gratitude to the surgeon for disabling someone who you love very much, because the alternative was that that person would not be alive today if it wasn't for that, for what happened. So a person can come back somewhat disfigured, but yet they're alive. I'm just happy that they're alive. And that's the attitude that a righteous person has, the way the Ramchal expresses it. It's no coincidence that Nachum Ish Gamzu was a quadruple amputee. You see, in other words, the Ramchal is picking up on that very analogy of the story about Nachum Ish Gamzu. He truly felt that his arms and his legs were at fault for not acting quickly enough to help that very poor man who had come to him with his dying breath saying, just give me something to eat because I don't think I'm going to make it another few minutes. And Nachum Ish Gamzu said, just wait a minute, I'll be with you in just a moment. Something very, very normal, because he didn't realize how truly sickly this person was. But he felt that because his arms and his legs had contributed to the sin, he needed to be amputated. He needed to have that expiation, that removal of the flaw. Now, how many of us can actually have that perspective in life? I think it's very, very difficult, if not impossible for most people. And therefore, we can look back and discuss the story and say a person with complete faith, with really true vision of seeing the larger picture, can actually take an inventory of all of the suffering of his or her life and say, yeah, there was something, there was a reason for this. There was something good that came out of it. In retrospect, I can look back at all of the different chapters of my life and see how everything that has happened to date has actually contributed to something positive. I would have loved to have avoided that or this, but in the totality of things, there really is something good that has really emanated from all of the different chapters of my life. And if I can't fully see all of the good that has emanated from those different chapters, it's because I'm still in the middle of the book. And I have to get to the next chapter or the next 10 chapters perhaps to really be able to see with retrospect how things that have already happened have transpired. And our lives are a book. And a lot of times we don't get to see the reconciliation until we're at the very last chapter. Yeah.
In this example that the Nesilas Yesharim brings, it's not exactly the same thing, because he's talking about a doctor who's just a messenger, and he's cutting away the bad so you can live. But what about the fact that Hashem is the one that made the person become sick to begin with? And if he hadn't been sick, he wouldn't have had to have this cutting away. Of course you're grateful to the
What is
doctor.
the sickness in the analogy? In the analogy, what is the sickness?
What do you mean?
In other words, sickness refers to a spiritual malady that a person has because of behaviors, attitudes that he's gone through in life. Person is spiritually sick when he speaks Lashon Hara or engages in behaviors that are self-destructive. And he develops disease as a result. He develops spiritual rot, spiritual decay as a result. And so a lot of times those are expiated through physical suffering. People become sensitized through experiences that they go through in life, whether it's loss of life, loss of limb, loss of loved ones, poverty. A lot of different types of suffering produce that amputation. We go through these types of amputation all the time in life. They're not physical amputations like Nachum Ish Gamzu, but we are humbled, we are sensitized, we are tenderized as a result of our suffering. Am I answering your question?
So you're saying it's better that Hashem punish you that way for your spiritual sins than just kill you?
Yeah, because the alternative would have been, I'm an enriched human being today, because through that experience, that suffering that I've gone through, I'm now able to rehabilitate myself instead of just dying in a state of imperfection. I'm able to work on tomorrow is going to be a better day. I'm able to become a better person.
Well, ideally, you'd like to learn lessons without all that suffering. Like we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, like erase all of our sins, but not by the way of, terrible diseases.
Yes, and so how do we do that?
Tshuva.
Yeah, that's how, we there are two ways that sin is amputated. One way is through suffering, and the other way is through tshuva.
I choose the latter.
Yeah, good, yes.
But it seems to me that a lot of suffering, especially your parent, is a result of seeing people close to you suffer. So it's very hard to say, well, God forbid, this person in my family is suffering because of something that I've done, right? It's one thing to say maybe it's a reflection of something that I personally have done when it's happening to you, but when it's happening to somebody else.
In my own life experiences, I would tell you that that's even more painful than suffering yourself.
Right.
Right? I would rather have been in the hospital myself than seeing one of my children in the hospital. So that, to me, was the most curative kind of experience I've ever had in my life. That doesn't explain why it happened to that child,
Right.
but it certainly explains why I am the parent of that child and why it happened to me as a parent. God's system is interlocking. It's a perfect system. I can't explain, I don't have an answer for why that child of mine was afflicted, but I can certainly try to make sense of why I had to go through that kind of suffering, which is actually, in many ways, even worse than the child's himself. Right?
But then it's almost like the family member is being used as sort of a vehicle for your own.
Well, we're all vehicles of each other. We are all vehicles of each other. That's what Akedas Yitzchak teaches us. And we are all vehicles of each other. That doesn't mean that we aren't being used for ourselves as well. Primarily, I'm a vehicle for me. But I can also be a vehicle for you. That if something happens to me and you're affected by it, so then I was a vehicle to help affect you. That's why God creates a sense of society, families, communities. Because we all interlock in some way.
But you're saying there's no such thing as collateral damage. Like when Hashem decides something, everyone gets what they deserve, not just, I have to punish this person, all right, so he'll also be affected.
Yeah. Well, Atzur Tamim Pa'alo is what we affirm, is that even when things appear to be just purely collateral damage, there is no such thing as an imperfect system. Because collateral damage is really, what does that term mean? It means my main target is that person, and if other people have to suffer gratuitously and when they don't deserve it, no. That's not fair. That's not just. So we as humans accept collateral damage, but God doesn't accept it. We don't always understand. Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
Patricia.
Yeah, I can accept that to the point where something bad happened to me many years ago. My life has developed since that point, and I'm glad I am where I am now, and it probably wouldn't have happened if that tragedy hadn't happened when it did. I can accept certain things for others. What I cannot accept is what happened, for example, to my husband's family in Poland. They didn't even get to the camps. He lost a 2-year-old cousin, he lost a 7-year-old cousin, he lost a 12-year-old cousin, he lost a 16-year-old cousin, he lost his grandparents, he lost aunts and uncles, and they didn't even get to the camps. It was the Holocaust by bullets.
Yeah.
And those lives were cut off, and I can't see how that really, I mean, I just, that's where I can't get beyond that.
And that's why we say Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo. The rock whose acts are just or pure, he's the rock. And we won't be able to answer those questions. We have to resign ourselves at some point to saying, I don't understand the specifics of the system. Yes?
I'd like to respond to
Yes.
Patricia.
Yeah.
My name's Kala, by the way. And ask the Rob something at the same time, but may I contradict the Rob?
Go right ahead. That's what this class is about.
Okay.
Proving me wrong.
Okay. According to Rabbi Akiva Katz, he gave a great audio on Simple to Remember, exactly about the subject that you just mentioned, and he differentiates between things that are, as the Rav was saying, and evil people, and the free will of evil people, and to what extent Hashem allows. And he basically comes down and says, we don't believe in fatalism as Jews. We don't believe in fatalism. We don't look at people who are suffering from other people, they're robbed or whatever, and say, he must have deserved it. We don't say that, and we don't believe that. And he said, he said, we can also learn it from Pero. Pesach, he said, why was Pero punished? He was doing what Hashem wanted him to do. It was decreed. Why should he be punished? Well, he went beyond because he had a certain element of free will, and he went beyond, so he was punished. So Rabbi Katz.
So Chal, I'm going to interrupt you because
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize any person to monopolize the class. But I know the direction that you're going. The conflict between free will and determinism is a very, very vast subject. It is something that was undertaken in the earliest period of the medieval philosophers. And there's volumes and volumes that we can go into. So it's not just Rabbi Akiva Tatz, it's just a vast, vast subject.
Well, he quoted the Rambam, and he said
Yeah,
basically...
it goes even to St. Augustine and like a millennium before the Rambam. So what I'd like to do is, I'm going to put that aside.
Okay.
And what we're going to say is that there are going to be certain questions about the conflicts between free will and determinism that cannot be answered. We'll also point out that there are many different approaches to this subject. And if you're interested, I can recommend a number of very good books, many of them which will leave you more puzzled because there is no easy reconciliation. Anyone who offers an easy reconciliation is not seeing the full picture because God deliberately leaves certain things beyond our mortal grasp. There are many, many apparent contradictions that exist in our purview and our understanding of the God system of justice. And that's why I think that ultimately we will have to resign ourselves, no matter what kind of reconciliation we want to come to saying Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo. Those three simple words. God is the rock. From his perspective, everything works out. From our perspective, it doesn't work out. The Ishbitzer had a fantastic phrase. He said that there are certain things that are tachat tfisato, that are within our grasp, and certain things that are beyond our grasp. The challenge in life is to always try and raise that ceiling of reconciliation and of understanding, with the final resignation that there is a ceiling. There is a ceiling. No matter how high we raise that ceiling, we will eventually hit a final ceiling. Yes, Karen?
What is determinism?
Determinism basically means that God ultimately is running the show. God has foreknowledge, omniscience, and understands what's going to happen even before it happens. Maimonides himself says, how do you reconcile God's omniscience with man's free will? That's the famous question that Maimonides asked. Maimonides leaves off by saying, Ki lo machshavotai machshavotechem velo darchechem derachai no'um Hashem. The prophet Isaiah says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Your ways are not my ways. And therefore, you can't possibly understand how it makes sense to me, even though it may not make sense to you. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it.